only the panel is allowed to have the video on. Questions for the panelists can be sent via the chat box. And then when sending your questions, please identify yourself and your organization. And finally, if there is an opportunity to speak, you'll be called to do so. So I'll hand over to my good Lily.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joseph. And well, good morning, good afternoon to all. And welcome to this webinar that speaks to the bipartisan perspective to the 2020 presidential US presidential elections. And this is coming to you from the American Business Council and in partnership with McLarty Associates. And this webinar is obviously an interesting deviation from our previous webinars and the ones you may have attended in recent times. You know, obviously with the ominous cloud of COVID hanging over our heads. But, you know, elections are pretty important as well. In Africa alone, we're going to be having at least about 10 presidential elections, one coming from our neighbor just around the corner, Ghana, December the 7th. And while these are very important, because we do know that, you know, politics really cradle economic and in most cases diplomatic decisions. And I would not waste much of our time, but would like to introduce the two speakers who, like I shared with them before we started, are heavyweights in themselves, not in terms of their physical size, but obviously in terms of their accomplishments. So now I would like to start off with introducing Nelson, who is the president and co-founder of the McLarty Associates. So Nelson first worked with Joe Biden for over 20 decades, serving as Biden's general counsel, the Judiciary Committee, Senate, the Senate Judiciary Committee. Over the past year, Nelson has been deeply involved in the Biden campaign, serving as an outside advisor on trade and foreign policy issues. He also served in the Obama-Biden transition team in 2008 and has advised every Democratic presidential campaign since 2004 on foreign policy and trade matters. Prior to his co-founding McLarty Associates, Mr. Cunningham served in the White House as a special advisor to President Clinton on the Western Hemisphere affairs and as general counsel at the White House Office of Administration. So he holds a BA from Yale University and a JD from Stanford University. So also, I won't say the other side, but speaking obviously from another perspective, will be Ambassador Rick Burt. He is the managing partner of McLarty Associates. And Ambassador Rick Burt was a political appointee in senior foreign policy roles during the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administration, served as an ambassador to Germany, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe under President Ronald Reagan, and under President George H.W. Bush. He was a chief negotiator to the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty START. Ambassador Burt was also a top national security advisor to John McCain's 2000 and 2008 campaign. He was also a one-time advisor to Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. Very interesting. Ambassador Burt worked for a decade at McKinsey, and early in his career was a New York Times reporter. He has a BA from Cornell University and MA from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. At this point, I will just hand over to Nelson. And so, Nelson, up to you.
Good. Thank you so much, Margaret, for that introduction. What a pleasure to be here with the American Business Council of Nigeria. My partner, Rick Burt, and also the head of our Africa practice, someone well known to all of you, Ambassador Terrence McCulley. Terry is on the line with us. I've told him that if the questions get too difficult, Ambassador Burt and I are going to pitch it over to him for responses. No one knows Nigeria better than he does, and no one knows Africa better than he does. He's a marvelous, marvelous colleague to work with, as you all know personally. I myself have never had the pleasure of traveling to Nigeria. I did take my daughter to South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe 2 years ago, and it opened her eyes, it opened my eyes, and I look forward to having the chance to travel to Nigeria. Well, I guess once we're permitted to travel, whenever that might be. In the meantime, we have the benefit of being able to connect directly with these sorts of conversations, and I hope that this is a benefit to you. I have known Joe Biden a long time. He brought me to Washington 26 years ago to serve as his general counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I had the privilege of working with him for a year before going to the Clinton White House. I have then been a member of Biden's extended political family ever since. I supported him in 2007. Pardon me. It's allergy season in Washington, and it's hitting me at the wrong time. I had the privilege of supporting him in 2007, 2008, when he last ran for president, and of supporting him in this race very closely. I was with him and his team for the Iowa caucuses. I was with him for the New Hampshire primary. I was with him for the South Carolina primary, where he won, and then watched with great pride the next week as he swept the Super Tuesday states, and in early March effectively locked down the nomination. We have to remember, this is the earliest Democrats have settled on a nominee since 2004. And what's happened since he effectively took the nomination is the Democratic Party has done something very uncharacteristic. They've unified. They've all come behind him. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders famously never really reconciled himself to Hillary Clinton's win 2016. Half of his supporters in 2016 did not vote for Hillary Clinton. And given the narrow nature of that election, that may very well have thrown it to President Trump. So his support, that of the progressive left and the center, is remarkable for the Democrats. I think Democrats are unified for two reasons. One, Donald Trump powerfully energizes his supporters. He also powerfully energizes the opposition. And as a Democrat, I'm certainly seeing that across the board. The second reason is the current pandemic, which has placed America in a extraordinarily difficult situation from a public health standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and now just in the last week with these terrible riots and with the reminder of the racial divisions that have riven America for all of our history, and which we still have not put to bed, divisions that Nigerians understand all too well, because you may not only feel it when you're here in the United States, but you also feel it when you look at the decisions of this administration with respect to Nigerian visas, Nigerian travelers to the United States, and of course some of the comments that President Trump himself has made about Nigeria and some of your fellow countries in Africa. So Democrats are united. I took a look at the polling. Every single national poll since February 14th shows Joe Biden ahead. Two of them show him tied. but you have to go back to February to find a poll that puts Donald Trump ahead of Joe Biden. It's a remarkable place for Biden to find himself now. In recent weeks, that his lead has increased. A poll yesterday has him 11 points ahead of Donald Trump. Well, you may well say, yeah, but Hillary Clinton was ahead, and it didn't do her any good. In fact, she was ahead on the day of the election, and she still lost. So I start with the question: does Donald Trump have a lock on the states that gave him the win 3 years ago? If I could ask to have the slide pulled up that has the voting information, so that I can share it with our viewers, I'd appreciate that. Can we pull that up? I'm not seeing it if you've been able to pull it up. Well, let me just walk you through it. The three states that gave Donald Trump the win in 2016, despite being almost 3 million votes behind Hillary Clinton, were Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Here we go. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And you can see in 2016 how bright red those three states were. We can scroll down so we can look at the numbers down below. You see that his out of more than 9 million votes cast, his margins in those three states were narrow, but nevertheless absolute. 11,000, 23,000, 44,000 for a razor-thin win in those three states of 78,000 votes. So the question is there any chance this year that we can change that? And I took a look at the midterm elections, which happened in 2018. How did Democrats do against Republicans in those federal elections? And the results are right in front of you. It's a startling swing. From being down 11,000 in Michigan, they were up by 300,000. After being down by 23,000 in Wisconsin, they were up by 240,000. In Pennsylvania, down 44,000, they won by nearly 600,000 votes. A total swing in those three states, 1.1 million votes. That shows that when Democrats are energized, as they were in 2018, that they can come and defeat Donald Trump handily, and the Republicans handily, in key swing states. If you look at the polling today, in fact, the battleground states have expanded. In Florida, which Donald Trump, these are all states Donald Trump won in 2016. Florida, Biden's ahead by more than 3 points. In Pennsylvania, he's ahead by 8 points. In Michigan, he's ahead by 8 points. In Wisconsin, he's ahead by 5 points. And in Arizona, he's ahead by almost 4 points. Arizona, do you know how many times Arizona has voted for a Democrat in the last 70 years? Once. And that was in 1996 in Bill Clinton's reelection. It's the only time it's voted for a Democrat in the last 70 years. And yet here we are with, not only is Biden ahead, but Trump knows Biden is ahead. 3 weeks ago, when Trump first left the White House in the pandemic to travel, he traveled all the way across country to where? To Arizona, to visit a factory and do a campaign-style result. Why did he do that? He knows that Arizona is on the bubble. So Joe Biden is ahead. I believe that the true campaign, and we can take the slide down now. I'm done with that. Thank you for putting it up. I believe that the true campaign really started in the last week with the terrible race riots that we've seen in American cities. Before that, the campaign was about broad issues relating to Donald Trump, his leadership style, the divisions he's imposed in the United States. It was about the pandemic, the handling of the pandemic. It was about how to get us out of the economic hole. And those were all critically important issues and sharp distinctions. But in the last week, it's become about something even more profound. which is the racial divisions that have riven America for so long, and who is the leader that can help deal with those divisions. And I say deal because Trump and Biden have two very different approaches. Trump's approach is to separate, is to highlight differences and to divide the American people, as he did by bringing American troops into Washington streets, by pushing back protesters with tear gas and stun grenades so that he could clear the area to walk over to a church and hold up a Bible, appealing to his conservative evangelical supporters. Joe Biden has taken a very different approach. After he's been at home for the last 3 months dealing, we've all been in lockdown here in the US, and I think many have viewed him as being trapped there. But he's taken this occasion now in the last week to get out. He's been out in Wilmington. He was visiting with protesters. He got down on his knees to talk to the protesters. He went to a church, an African-American church in Wilmington, and spent over an hour talking to parishioners. He traveled to Philadelphia and gave a very powerful address yesterday, which I invite you to look up on YouTube or on the Joe Biden website, where he talked about these racial divisions and about how he would approach it, not by dividing us, but by trying to find common ground. As important a figure as former Defense Secretary and General Jim Mattis, who was Donald Trump's defense secretary, came out yesterday with a very powerful statement opposing the use of military troops against American citizens, and further saying that Donald Trump's leadership style of seeking to divide Americans rather than unite Americans was unprecedented and was dangerous for the country. An incredibly important move. This moment, in many ways, is made for my old boss, Joe Biden. He came into politics because of the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. He's always been a champion for African Americans. He's been a champion for Africa. He was a fighter against apartheid in South Africa. He's been a leader on better relations between the United States and Africa as senator, as head of the Foreign Relations Committee. As vice president, he played a leading role in Barack Obama's Africa policies. As we look ahead to the next weeks, and I'll conclude with this, we're going to have a campaign that is like nothing we've ever seen here in the United States. No crowds, no rallies, no shaking hands, no working the crowd, no kissing babies. Joe Biden loves people. He is hugely empathetic. He loves to talk to voters, to listen to voters. I've watched him kneel down next to an old woman who couldn't stand to hear her story. I've seen him pick up a child to have the story, whisper in his ear what the child wants to tell him. It's very hard for Biden not to touch people, to be with people, to see people, to be right with them. But I think the terrible crisis of the last week has given him the emotional hook and energy to reach out and through the screens connect with the American people. Will we have a convention in August? I don't know. I doubt it. We're certainly not going to have the kind of old style convention of 50,000 people thronged in a convention hall applauding the nominees' words. The campaign is looking at some very creative alternatives to that, which will mix smaller regional gatherings with some interesting digital approaches that will try to help connect the public to Biden and to other Democratic candidates at that time. And then we'll go into the final stretch. There's a great worry that because of the pandemic, that because of a switch from in-person voting to mail voting, that there's lots of room for mischief in how the vote will be carried out. There's lots of ways in which a president with his vast resources can try to interfere with the vote. And there's great fear of that, I have to say. It's going to be a remarkable next set of months. I certainly hope that at the end of it, I'm able to celebrate, whether I'm there in the same room with them or just watching a screen from my home that I'll be able to celebrate victory with my old boss, Joe Biden. And now let me turn it over to Richard Burt to tell you all the ways in which I'm wrong. Rick, you're on mute.
Thank you, Nelson. And I'm not going to spend too much time emphasizing what you got wrong, because there was actually, in terms of your overall analysis, much that I can agree with. I think one thing I can agree with is your concept of the really unprecedented moment that we now confront in the United States in terms of our politics looking towards the November election. Really three different crises that are conflating to make American politics truly unpredictable right now. One is, of course, the pandemic, which is still with us. Over 100,000 Americans have died of the coronavirus. We have well over 1 million cases. And while states are beginning to reopen, the number of cases is continuing to grow. Secondly, mainly because of the virus, the United States is facing a serious economic challenge. We have almost 40 million people unemployed, and that is a challenge that any new administration, Trump or a Biden administration, will have to address later this year or early next year. And finally, as you I think very eloquently explained, Nelson, we now have a new crisis in the form of the tragic death that took place as a result of police brutality in Minneapolis, which has spread not only throughout the country in terms of protests and civil rights demonstrations, but is actually spreading worldwide. So it is an unprecedented and unpredictable period. And I think on balance, I would agree with the view that Joe Biden, who is the challenger to Donald Trump, is probably better positioned at this point to win the election in November. However, do not rule Donald Trump out. Not only was he seen as someone who couldn't win in 2016, but I think despite the various challenges that the United States faces, he does still have an opportunity to win in November. And let me begin by just reminding everybody that if we're talking now in June about a November election, we should remember what the former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson once said, when he said, "A week is a long time in politics." So a lot can change between June and November when the Americans will go to the polls. There are three initial points I would make about Donald Trump and his positioning for the presidential election. First, Donald Trump is still viewed as an outsider, and he thinks like an outsider, and he takes advantage of the fact that even after 3 years and 4 years in the presidency, he is not seen as part of the Washington elite. He is seen as somebody who represents the little guy against the Washington elite and against the powerful forces in American society. So he likes to position himself as somebody who's fighting for the little guy, for the people whose voices are not being heard in Washington, and people who have failed in terms of our foreign policy and getting us into enormously expensive and unproductive wars in the Middle East, as well as people who failed in terms of the financial crisis that the world went through a decade ago. Trump still tries to position himself as someone who understands the little guy. Number two, is a curious mix between, on the one hand, wanting to appear like a strong man, somebody who can stand up to bullies, who is tough, rough and tough, and is a strong president, and is a counterpuncher. When he's criticized, he'll criticize right back. But at the same time, Donald Trump likes to think of himself as a victim, somebody who is constantly under attack from his enemies. So that makes him a very difficult opponent. He believes that the establishment, what he likes to call the deep state in Washington, is out to get him, and he is prepared to stand up to those critics when necessary. And this makes Trump, I think, a particularly formidable political force, someone that's really unique in modern American politics. That leads to my second argument about Trump, which is his support base. Donald Trump has never, as president, gotten more than 50% approval ratings as president. So he was elected in 2016 with 2 million votes less than Hillary Clinton, and I'll explain why in a moment. But while he has a smaller support base, that support base is highly motivated, highly energetic. So while Nelson argues correctly that Biden scores better in the polls, when these pollsters talk to the supporters of Biden versus Trump, they find that the intensity of Trump's support, the strength of that Trump minority for Donald Trump, is stronger than that Biden majority for Joe Biden. So what the pollsters are finding, that even while Biden seems to be ahead in most polls, that Trump supporters are more likely than Biden supporters to actually show up and vote. And in some respects, if you've ever seen a Trump rally, you can understand this. The Trump's supporters are people who share with Trump this sense of being victimized. So they see in Trump a strong leader, but they also see somebody like them who they feel has been harmed by the elite, and they can identify with a Donald Trump who's standing up for them. And he's really completely revolutionized the Republican Party from what was an upper middle class party to now a lower middle class party of people who are less educated, who tend to be people who are blue collar workers, and people who view Trump as a kind of political savior. And that takes me to a third point, I think, in looking at this election you have to take into account, and that is our curious electoral college, which is written actually into our law and our Constitution, in that it gives smaller, less populated states an outsized influence on the outcome of our election. I mentioned in 2016 that Hillary Clinton won 2 million more votes than Donald Trump, but she lost the presidency because she didn't win in terms of the electoral college, which is allocated in terms of states. And political scientists have even done an analysis that shows that it's possible that Donald Trump could lose to Joe Biden by 4 million votes and still potentially win in the electoral college. And that's going back to Nelson's interesting maps of those states where the Democrats did much better in 2018 than 2016. The only point I would make is in 2018, those were congressional elections. Donald Trump was not on the ballot. And in 2020, of course, he will be on the ballot of all those states, and thus, I think, potentially attract more votes for the Republicans than they received in 2018. But because we're 5 months or so away from the election, I think it's possible to say that there will be a couple of overriding issues that will determine the outcome. One will continue to be, I think, the pandemic. It hasn't gone away. And the question that voters will probably ask themselves is, has Trump managed this health crisis well enough for me to justify voting for him? At this point, the jury is out. We have lost a lot of lives. The virus is continuing, as I said earlier, is continuing to spread in the United States. But there are also signs that with the reopening, the American economy is beginning to grow again. So the question, I think, now is it's just unclear to what degree the pandemic will hurt or help Trump by November. Another issue, though, and a critical one, and Nelson focused on this, is the impact of the events of the last week or so, with the protests, demonstrations, and debate that's growing in the United States about whether we have an equal justice system for everybody. And here, I think it's not clear how this debate will, in the end, work out. On the one hand, I agree with Nelson's characterization of Joe Biden's treatment of this issue. He is appealing for unity. He is reaching out, and he does have a track record which says that he is prepared to focus on issues of racial equality and integration and fairness. At the same time, we have had a great deal of violence in the country, and Donald Trump is clearly decided that he's going to play the law and order card in terms of this election. And to many people, it reminds them of the 1968 presidential election, when then Republican candidate Richard Nixon was running for president. And in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination, Nixon played the law and order card, and particularly white suburban voters afraid of rioting, of violence, voted for Nixon. Trump seems to be trying to replicate that experience, and to make the issue not so much one of racial equality and focusing on policing, but moving it to the issue of fears of disruption and dissent and instability by focusing on violence and the dangers of violence. I think it's too early to tell which one of these approaches, unity, which is what Biden is focused on, or really division, which Trump is using as a political card, will prevail in the 2020 elections. In fact, I would finish my presentation by saying, depending on who wins this election, will tell you a good deal about what kind of country the United States in 2020 is what kind of country we are.
I wonder, Margaret, if I could jump in with just a couple of quick comments on Rick's excellent presentation. May I? I'd make three quick points. First of all, I agree completely with Rick that Donald Trump is a master at motivating his base. He is a master at making deals with his various constituent groups. Evangelicals, you in Nigeria, you know the power of fundamentalist religion, whether Muslim or Christian. You know the power of it. Donald Trump does too. And he says to his conservative religious voters, I know you don't like my personal lifestyle. I've been married 3 times. You don't like that. I had famous affairs. You don't like that. You don't like my manner, but how do you like the conservative judges that I'm sending you? How do you like my conservative social policies? And they all nod and say, we'll take that. He says to CEOs, you don't much like my trade policy, do you? But tell you what, CEOs, do you like my tax cuts and my deregulation? And they nod, and he says, so that's my deal with you. He says to farmers, you may not like my trade war with China because it hurts your sales of soybeans, pork, and other things. But how do you like my conservative social policies? How do you like my support for gun rights? And they nod and say, yeah, we'll take that. So one, he's very good at doing that. Rick is absolutely right on that. Second, Rick is also right that this reminds us a lot of 1968 and the chaos of that year redounded to Richard Nixon's benefit. I agree, we don't know exactly how that will play this year. The third thing I'll say is that the current situation here puts the Democrats in a place where the left and the center are going to have different prescriptions for how to deal with this situation. Already the economic crisis caused by the pandemic has the left coming up with new ideas that the center, Joe Biden's center, must process. And now the racial problems are bringing the left back with more ideas and more issues. Biden is going to have to see how he can maneuver. Can he keep his left? Can he embrace their ideas? Status quo won't serve in these times. Can he embrace their ideas without alienating the middle, the moderates, the centrists, the independents around the country that he needs for support? And that, I think, is an open question. Margaret, I think we'd be delighted to hear the questions from members.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nelson. I would actually start. We have a couple of questions that have been sent through the chat, but I would like to start by asking some questions myself. So that my first question would go to you, Rick. So we have gradually seen China as a superpower playing critical roles in the African region, dominant roles for that matter, in terms of trade at all. And we have seen also the love-hate relationship, the President Trump has with China and with the Chinese leader. What do we have currently, or what do you think the President Trump's plan is to improve relations with China? The second question would be to Nelson. What is Joe Biden's foreign policy, or what would be his foreign policy if he wins? So while you're answering those questions, I would collate the other questions and share them with you.
Rick, you're muted.
Your question about China is a very good one, and I think the way you answer that, first of all, is to say, almost regardless of who is in the White House, U.S.-Chinese relations are going to become more difficult and more complicated by virtue of, I think, a growing consensus in American foreign policy circles, both amongst Republicans and Democrats and independents, analysts, that the United States has been overly optimistic about the prospects for good U.S.-Chinese relations. I think that particularly with the arrival of the current Chinese leader and the growing sense that China is becoming more autocratic and authoritarian, and as China expands its political, its economic and military power, not only in East Asia, but increasingly globally, that the United States faces a major rivalry with China. And so there is, I think, a growing consensus that the United States needs to address the emergence of China as a global superpower. That doesn't mean that there can't be areas of accommodation and collaboration, but increasingly, I think you will see competition between the United States and China. Now, Trump's specific approach is much more, in my view, short-sighted, in the sense that he is right now almost exclusively focused on getting reelected. So one of the tactics he's used in dealing with the pandemic and the coronavirus has been to say, this really isn't my fault, and the problems we've had addressing the coronavirus here is not my fault. It's really the fault of China, along with others like the WHO. But he wants to create this idea that if the Chinese had been more transparent earlier on, that the United States would have been more successful in coping with the virus. So he sees, I think, China and now taking a very negative position on China because of the coronavirus as an election tool. The second point I would make that is kind of unique to Trump and his approach to China and foreign policy generally is he views the world in terms of his famous book, The Art of the Deal. So he tends to view foreign policy as what he can achieve himself sitting in a room negotiating with a foreign partner. So he doesn't see foreign policy as part of a broad process, kind of strategic enterprise. He sees it more in terms of his background in real estate, where he could go in, sit down, cut a deal, and then move on. And so it's all very much personalized. So you do get this kind of strange aspect of American foreign policy where the bureaucracy, the State Department, the Defense Department, other departments have a view or a policy towards a country. And then Trump has his own kind of personalized policy, which is very much focused around the leader. So it's perfectly possible that in a second Trump administration, Trump would try to get along with Xi and try to talk to him, while at the same time, U.S.-Chinese relations got increasingly competitive, and even to the point of potential instability by virtue of this more broader institutional rivalry between the two governments.
Yeah, thanks. Nelson, please can you answer the question or share your thoughts about the question I asked?
Yes, I'll be very happy to. Margaret, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I am.
Good. Thank you. I would say that Joe Biden's foreign policy is going to be what I would characterize briefly as back to the future. He gave a speech in Munich at the security conference last year whose headline was, "America will be back." And he wants to bring America back. He wants to bring America back to the international world. He wants to bring America back to Europe, back to Asia, back to Africa, back to India as partners, as true partners, as reliable partners, and undo the damage wrought by Trump's much more a confrontational and transactional approach, which Rick Burt described well. Biden, the people advising Biden are the people who advised him and Barack Obama. They come from a very mainstream approach to foreign affairs, and I might say until Donald Trump, a bipartisan mainstream approach to foreign affairs. He will look to build in Africa, starting there. He will look to build on the strong record of bipartisan support on medical issues, PEPFAR, aid, the trade deals with sub-Saharan Africa have had wide bipartisan support. There really is a consensus in the United States that, and in Washington, except for in this White House, that the United States has an obligation to Africa, but also it's in America's interest to partner with Africa to help bring economic growth to Africa, to keep it vibrant, and to help Africa deal with its myriad social and economic problems, not as dependencies, but as partners of the United States. With regard to China, I think it's a critical part. I agree with Rick that there is a bipartisan change here in attitudes toward China. Since Richard Nixon first traveled there in the 1970s, there's been bipartisan consensus that the way to deal with China was to engage with it. To use Bob Zoellick's famous phrase, as a responsible stakeholder. Let's bring China into the international system. We will force her to mature. We will engage with her. We'll engage with her commercially. We'll engage on people to people, and this will gradually liberalize China. Clearly, that has not been the case, and in part it goes back 5 or 6 years ago to when Xi Jinping took power and took China in a decidedly different course. What Biden will do with China is to bring back the alliance-based structures that we've used ever since the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. He'll go to our allies that deal with China. He'll go to our Asian allies, our Southeast Asian allies, and he'll look to them to try to put together a unified approach on dealing with China and on bringing China to raise China's standards on its international dealings, its respect for human rights, and to improve the quality of its development programs. Will it be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP? No, but it might look in the broad brushes like the same type of matter. With regard to China and Africa, and I'll end on this, I think you'll see a much more robust foreign aid coming out of a Biden administration. You'll see a desire to help Africans avoid an entanglement with China, a dependency on China, by working with Africa to help provide development funds, but also trade, commerce, interchange that will allow the Africans to have a choice and not feel that they're being driven into the arms of the Chinese. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Fumi. I don't know if you'd like to ask the question, but because I don't see you raising your hand. But we have a question to Ambassador Richard. So Donald Trump has revolutionized the Republican Party, transforming it from an upper class intellectual party into a working class blue collar party, as you noted. So this used to be one of the traditional bases for the Democratic Party. So what can the Democratic Party do to win back this base beyond just labeling them as deplorables, as we saw in the last election?
I'm sure Nelson will also want to address that. I think that the important distinction, and I appreciate the question about moving, as I said, the Republican Party from an upper middle class to a lower and even working class party. The important, though, distinction currently between, let's say, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in terms of looking at lower middle class and working class voters is that, of course, in the case of the Republican Party, we're talking about white voters. And in the case of the Democratic Party, we're talking about not so many white voters and more people of color. And so the real question is, and this is, I think, again, my comments in terms of for the Republicans is what kind of party do they want to be in the long run strategically? When I was a member of the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan liked to describe himself as a big tent Republican. In other words, he welcomed anybody of any kind of economic class or any kind of race or ethnic background was welcome to be a Republican if they supported the basic policies of the party. The problem that the Republican Party has today, because it is becoming almost an exclusively white party, is, as most of you probably know, by the middle of this century, if not before, whites in the United States will make up less than 50% of the American population. And so if the Republican Party continues to focus on simply attracting white voters, they will not in the long run survive. And that's the challenge, I think, beyond Trump that the Republican Party faces in the long term. The problem is that I think the Democrats face in this election, though, is a little bit different. And maybe Nelson will want to kind of address this himself, but Nelson quite eloquently described what I call Biden's dilemma, which is Biden is basically, in the Democratic Party, in my view, a moderate. He's always been a moderate. He's not been a leftist. But the most energetic part of the Democratic Party today, especially in terms of the current protests which are underway in the United States, are on the left, and they're also made up with a large number of African Americans, and so Biden's choice of vice president is really going to be critical, I think, because it'll at his age, it's going to send a signal to the Democratic Party and American voters as a whole about where he thinks the Democratic Party should go. And so he faces the dilemma, I think, of maybe of wanting to get, on the one hand, the energy from picking a sort of person from the left, let's say an African American woman who's on the left, versus someone who's seen as more moderate. And so it's the dilemma he has is if he does choose somebody that is seen as someone who's going to be maybe too radical or too much on the left, he can then, Donald Trump can then exploit this law and order issue that he's waiting to use in the coming election.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question that you pose. It used to be said in the United States that voters vote their pocketbooks. That the way to appeal to voters is by appealing to their economic interest. I'm not certain that's true anymore. I think increasingly Americans vote their values. I know that's true. For example, If you look at upper middle class professionals in the United States are increasingly Democratic. Well, you might say, that's not in your economic interest. You're likely to raise your taxes. You're likely to wind up having to pay for people at the bottom of the pyramid for medical care and housing and food aid and others. Why would you do that? Well, it's because they're voting their values, and they're proud to vote their values. Say to working class people, you could argue to them, you know, honestly, a Republican administration is not good for you. They oppose minimum wage increases. They oppose worker rights in factories. They oppose unionization. They oppose lots of things that will help your life materially. But they support the Republicans for values reasons, whether religion, cultural. And I'm not sure that Biden has an easy solution for that. I don't think you can go to working class whites without college degrees, sort of the classic Trump base. He will sound like he's talking down to them if he explains to them that economically they'll be better off with a Democrat in the White House, even though they will. What I think he can do, and I think he will do, is he'll look to appeal to them on values. He'll look to appeal to their better nature. Working class African Americans and working class whites face exactly the same types of challenges, but from opposite sides of the streets and opposite sides of cities. I think Biden will look to appeal to the commonality of their situations and say, you're not different, you look different, your color is different, but the challenges you and your families and your children face are not different. Let me show you how I'm presenting solutions that will help all of you in a fair way and in a way that will bring us together. I think that's the approach he needs to take, and I think it's the approach we're seeing him take this year. But he is not going to play the politics of division. He's not going to play what they call play the race card in a hostile way, in a negative way. It's not his style. It's not his manner, and it's not the way that he will seek to win this election.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot. I know we have 2 more minutes. I have a question which is also directed at Nelson. Quite a lot of young, educated Black, would I say, Nigerian Americans I know have been concerned about the 1994 controversial law, crime law that Joe Biden, kind of helped to kind of write. And each time I engage with, a couple of them, I get this feedback that, oh yeah, I mean, we would love to, vote for Biden, but we're not really sure if it's just not, the same, coin on the other side, if you know what I mean. So can you quickly speak to that? I know we just have 2 minutes before we round.
Yeah, Margaret, I'm happy to. That is an excellent question. And frankly, it shows how the Nigerian diaspora community in the United States brings Nigerians so close to America, just as it does with Chinese, with Vietnamese, with Mexicans, with so many communities around the world. The interchange between the diaspora communities in the United States and those at home, it's instantaneous and it's fluid. It's an excellent question. I know a lot about the 1994 crime bill because I was working for Joe Biden when it was passed. I also know a lot about the circumstances that caused it to happen because before coming to work for Biden, I was a federal prosecutor in New York for 6 years during the height of the crack epidemic in the late 80s and early 90s. I think young people today don't know, they weren't there. They need to be reminded that at that time, the crime wave that was overwhelming American cities because of the drugs, because of the crack addiction, heroin, other addictions, were tearing cities apart. We're making them unsafe, dangerous. There was a cry, including especially from communities of color, for more resources. And the 1994 crime bill brought many more resources. Yes, it brought police. It brought more police, to try to keep areas free from drugs and free from violence that preyed on people in those communities. It brought lots of community programs, lots of money and support for community programs that would allow young people to have alternatives to gangs and to drug dealing. And it did impose higher sentences for drug dealers. Now, there's a lot of, I think, respectfully, I'd say, I think there's a lot of confusion about what Biden did there. For one thing, almost all people in America who are in jail for drug crimes are in jail because of state drug crimes. Those subjected to federal law, it's a very small number. It is generally those who sell large quantities of drugs. Users, mere users, a kid with a marijuana stick in his pocket, somebody with 3 vials of crack for their own use, those people were never targeted by federal law, including by the 1994 crime bill. They went after dealers, they went after distributors, and the federal one specifically focused on those who moved large masses of drugs. Yes, those people were treated harshly, but those people were causing great damage across our society. So I think there's yes, it's true that in the wake of the tightening of drug laws in the early 90s, more African Americans and people of color found themselves in jail on drug crimes, but they were not there because they were users. Biden had a great deal of compassion for those who are addicted, who found themselves addicted to drugs, and put a lot of money and programs behind it in the 1994 crime bill. I know, I was there, I saw it. But those who are in jail as a result of that are the people who were preying on their communities, not the users. So I hope that we can, in the course of this campaign, that Joe Biden and his many supporters at the time and since in communities of color can help young people understand that those who are in jail are not in jail because they were users. They're in jail because they were predators selling drugs into their communities for their own profit. It's an excellent question, though.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nelson. And I believe with this, we have come to the end of this very interesting webinar. I'd like to thank the speakers once more that have shared their perspectives, and we look forward to what will happen in November and how eventually it would positively impact our country, Nigeria. So thank you once more, Nelson Cunningham and Ambassador Rick Burt.
Good. Thank you, Margaret. And I'd also like to thank my colleague, Ambassador Terry McCulley, who heads our Africa practice, who's been on the line and who is a great champion for Nigeria and for Nigerian issues, including commercial issues in the United States. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.